Ok, bien, bienvenidos a esta segunda sesión de Mujeres en Ciencia Cognitiva. Para el Laboratorio de Ciencias Cognitivas de la Universidad del Desarrollo es un agrado, estamos muy contentos de recibir a Charlotte van de Sandrecht, investigadora, doctora en Ciencia Cognitiva, psiquiatra, principalmente en temas de mind wandering, de vagabundeo mental, y de TDA, de déficit atencional, que nos va a comentar hoy día sobre investigaciones que ella ha realizado en los últimos años, principalmente en Bélgica y en Francia. Así que para nosotros es una gran felicidad tener a una investigadora internacional que nos cuente un poco de cómo es que ella ha desarrollado esta investigación en estos tópicos. Gracias, Charlotte, por acompañarnos.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for inviting me, and also Sophia that invited me for such an event. I will share my screen. So, no, that's not the beginning, sorry. So, exploring consciousness as a stream and its individual differences. As you said, yes.
Al parecer todavía no aparece la pantalla. ¿Puedes compartir la pantalla, por favor? ¿Sí? Todavía no nos aparece la presentación. Ahí sí, ahí está, perfecto. Ok. Ahora sí,
Okay,
todo de
sorry.
nuevo. No, todo bien.
In this presentation, as Gabrielle said, I will talk about mind wandering, but exactly to disentangle the possible miscomprehension of mind wandering and stuff, because there is a different kind of definition. I decided in my research to speak about stream of consciousness, and I will explain later. So in this picture, named Stream of Consciousness by an American artist, we can see that the character is flowing. I'm sorry, I don't see my notes, and which is a bit do you see the...
Solamente vemos tus notas, no la...
audience too.
No la diapositiva. Sí. Sí, al parecer solamente vemos las notas.
Yes. And there you see also the notes. Okay. Anyway, I will do without notes. Sorry.
No, y no vemos nada.
Anything. Okay.
Ahí sí.
Okay. So for me, this picture, as I said, illustrates quite well the notion of consciousness as a stream. Like, it's not a snapshot of an event, but it's more a continuous flow in which the flow of the river has its own force, but also the character can move within this flow. So this notion of stream of consciousness begins with some Buddhism, in Buddhism scripture under the name of mind stream, and you find all this notion evolving to the practice of mindfulness and meditation nowadays. In psychology sciences, William James is the father of this notion. In his Principle of Psychology, he dedicated one entire chapter named The Stream of Consciousness. He then, in it, he wrote, consciousness then does not appear to itself chopped up within bits. Such words are chain or train do not describe it fitly as it presents itself in the first instance. It is nothing joined, it flows. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In taking of it hereafter, let us call it the stream of thought or consciousness, or of subjective life. So starting with this notion, now how do we explore, how do we study, scientifically speaking, the stream of consciousness? Actually, mind-wandering research are the closest way to study that. That's why we speak about mind-wandering. What is the methodology of studying mind-wandering? While you perform a task, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Yes, no?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you. So while performing a task, here it's a very simple go, no go task. You have a stimulus to press a button and stimulus where you withdraw. The participant is randomly interrupted to report whether is on task. Here you can see the participant is completely focused on his screen, or mind wandering. The participant is still performing the class, but his mind is occupied by something completely different. Holidays, next weekend, what is going to eat tomorrow or tonight. To study the stream of thoughts, we notice that, yes, it's our mind is not a dichotomic process. We might think about things that are very close to the task at hand. For example, I'm quite sure that it happened to you when you perform a task. You might say, oh, I did a mistake, I must refocus, or, well, I'm performing quite well, I must be very well focused. And in this, when you think about this stuff, you're not in on-task focus anymore. You're more in this intermediate state. It is also possible that you are distracted by external stimuli. For example, a bell is ringing, or you see something completely different, whatever. It has to be here and now in your present environment. Mind wandering, in the strict definition by Smallwood and Schooler, is a mental content that is stimulus independent, so it's different from distraction, and self-generated. So, and it has nothing to do with the environment. It is also possible that sometimes you only know that you're not focused on the task, but it's impossible for you to report any mental content. And we call that mind blanking state. So we used I must say, I used with Michael Bastien, a former PhD student, we use this classification quite empirically, but the question we had at this moment is this classification valid? It seems yes to us, but it would be better to validate it. So how with the methodology we used in this case is we completely did the same methodology, but in one block called categorization, we use the classification, and in another block called descriptions, we ask the participants to report verbally and spontaneously the last thoughts they had in mind. And we recorded it in transcript. Here you can see the transcription. It's in French because I did it in France and Belgium. And when we had all these verbal reports, we asked 5 different judges. The judge were myself and Jerome, our supervisor, and the other students. And we classified each of the reports in one category. And when we were not able to, in one of the 5 categories, you see it here. And when it was impossible, it remained the possibility to say other. So you can see that here it's very low. So one of our goal was attained, like all the verbal report fit one and only one, and not another one. And we computed the inter-rater agreements, which is the Fleiss kappa here, which is a statistic to assess the agreement. You can see that the global Fleiss kappa is 0.62, and the other are between 0.6 and 0.8, which is a mean, which means a substantial agreement. So it seems that all the judges are quite agree with the definition of the classification and the report. Now, is it comparable with the participants' classification? So in this on these plots, we compared all the categories, whether it has been classified by the participants. FP-Kate is first person categorization, and TP-Kate is third person categorization. It is the agreement of the judge. And you see that all the differences here are non-significant. So it means that whether it has been categorized by the participant himself or a third person, a judge, participants are making quite the same amount of mental state reports. Similarly, here we compared the mental states reports by passation order. It means that maybe if you pass the categorization block first, of course the 2 blocks were counterbalanced, it might bias your response after all. You don't know. Before passing this experience, you probably never heard about this categorization or some of the mental states like task-related interference, and it could bias a participant's answer. So we compared here the categorization and description order by mental states. And you see here that, of course, it looks huge because the scale is very low, but still the differences here between the order of passation for each mental state is non-significant. So the categorization, the classification does not bias participants' responses. So in conclusion of this introductory experience, we have a valid classification. We can use it. And I might say, we'll see just after, that it's quite simple. Even children from 6, 7 years old can use it. So now, having this classification, and we said that we will speak about ADHD. What's the matter? So I think that you probably know about ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders. It's a disorder that combines attention deficit and impulsivity and hyperactivity, and the cognitive model, the most accepted is the model of executive control deficit. So what does the literature say about mind wandering and ADHD? Naturally, if you have a problem of attention control, the first hypothesis is, okay, they are mind wandering more. And the literature say yes, but it's a bit complicated. It's not always replicated, and it appears that it has some specific features, like, for example, Paul Selly found that it's only spontaneous mind wandering, and Franklin said that not all mind wandering, they're only unaware. So spontaneous, unaware, it might be a kind of different off-task category that I presented before. And for us, it rings really the bell of mind blanking. So maybe it's mind wandering, so you're off task, but it's a bit different than the strict definition of mind wandering. So we performed the task with participants that has ADHD. Children were diagnosed patients, but for adults, they only assessed a questionnaire. It was healthy population screened by the ADHD rating scale. Still the same task, a SART, a sustained attention to response task, which is a go-no-go with very rare no-go conditions, which is completely boring. You press all the time a button, and sometimes you have to reload. So it enhances mind wandering and all the attention drift. And with the classification that's just validated. And the result here has been published a few years ago, but I will describe it. So first of all, it's the mind blanking that is increased. Here you have the children, and this side, children responses and adults. So you see in children, here it's the ADHD diagnosed, but without methylphenidate treatment. Here is the treated patients with ADHD, the clinical control, and the healthy control. And in adults, the participants who scored clinically on the scale also show this increase, which is yes, it's almost 2 times the baseline of controls. In mind wandering in adults, there is no differences, but in children who are treated with methylphenidate, it increased, which is completely counterintuitive. Methylphenidate is prescribed to children to help them focus, not to help them mind wander. And there is no differences for the other mental states. In addition, when we add this two mental state, mind wandering and on task, we found that we have the same decrease than mind blanking. So it made us formulate the hypothesis that mind wandering require executive control, like any kind of train of thought to be sustained. And maybe that mind blanking is just a train of thoughts that just started or is not sustained enough to reach consciousness level. So here you have the classification with for the children with a little polar bear that we developed for the children. So what is the nature of mind blanking? What is mind blanking actually? So here, just to understand a bit our hypothesis, you can see that green parts are a train of thought and red another one, like it alternates. And maybe in ADHD, the stream of thought is more like this. You have more switch, more transition, and sometimes the transition are so rapid that it's impossible to report the thought content. And following this hypothesis, we developed a completely different kind of we tested the hypothesis of executive control with a data set by Beck, Mohammadi, and Mayer who collected that with more than 300 participants and tested the hypothesis we couldn't do on our own sample, which was much more smaller, around 40 participants by group for adults and 20 with the patients. So they did exactly the same methodology, and I'm really grateful to them. The dataset is available here on OSF. And first, they replicate our results, but you can see just on a matrix of correlation that mind blanking is positively correlated with response time, the standard deviation of response time. For those who don't know that, it's a measure of executive failure when the deviation, the response time variability is a measure of executive deficits. And the D prime, which is the performance parameter of the hit rates, and minus false alarm. And the D prime is more correlated with on-task focus, which is completely consistent. But no one of the other mental states correlated with the executive measures. Going into deeper details with mixed modeling, we perform a first mixed model, one mixed model on each mental states with ADHD score, D prime, and RTCV as predictive variables. And you see here that mind blanking is that ADHD score is negatively predicting mind blanking. So we replicate what we found in the previous article. But here we have negative prediction of D prime, and a positive of RTCV, which really means that executive measures, there is an executive deficit associated with mind blanking, whereas there is a marker of executive control, a better executive control associated with on task. Don't hesitate if you have questions to interrupt me. I feel like talking and talking, but
I think for the moment there's no question, so you can go.
Okay. And now we performed the same analysis, but only on the 4 or 3 previous trials to see really the local behavior of the participants. To note that the preceding trial do not predict the mental state, the reported mental states, which can be a bit of an importance on metacognition. Maybe participants do not rely on the previous trial, but more on 3 or 4 previous trials to formulate their response, subjective response. You can see here that mind blanking is both negatively predicted and positively predicted by negative by D prime and positively by RTCV on the 4 and 3 previous trials. I tried on the 5. If I remember well, it worked on mind blanking, but it was much more noisier for the other. And on task prediction, it's the opposite here, that you have a higher D prime, a positive prediction on task, and negative in RTCV. There is also, for each of the reports, there is a single signature. So maybe we unconsciously rely on our micro level behavior. On the performance, it seems quite obvious, but on the response time variability, it was more unknown. Like in task-related interference, you tend to be less variable, so more like when you're focused. But in mind wandering, you're more variable. So maybe maybe to make a decision on our subjective content, we also rely on our behavior. And just to mention this, it's a colleague of ours in the LSCP, Gabriel, I think you remember Thomas Andrion, who published 2 studies saying that mind blanking and mind wandering could correspond actually to local sleep in the brain, but are differently represented. The localization is quite different. Like mind wandering is more on frontal position, as mind blanking is more on parietal. Very interesting studies. So that makes sense. Like it could be, yeah, intrusion of sleep. So it makes me imagine something like that. In fact, our stream of consciousness is more continuous, and maybe there is a three-dimension possibility of representation. Here you would have the vigilant state. You can be asleep, you can be awake. And because we know that even when asleep, we have episodes of consciousness, and when we are awake, there is also episode of unconsciousness, when you're drunk, for example. And here, the second dimension could be executive control. If you control your attention, and the richness of content, for example. And in fact, your consciousness could move on this landscape from time to time. And maybe if a person scoring high on ADHD scale could be more switching and less staying switching from areas, and where another neurotypical person could be staying in the same area longer. The ADHD is more an explorer of the landscape. And this brings us to the exploration bias in ADHD. This idea comes from actually a journalist, Tom Hartman, who really is really a storytelling, like a re-empowerment tale for his son and maybe himself, because if you see the biography of this guy on Wikipedia, you can see that he made so many things in his life that he must be an explorer and have a personal interest in ADHD. And what is not completely obvious in ADHD is that the people who have ADHD are usually novelty seekers, and they, not all of them, but a great amount of these people. And they might also have sleep disorders, which are very frequent. I think it's around 40 to 70% of ADHD patients. And they also have different sensitivity to reward. So this idea of evolutionary perspective in mental disorders are really a big issue nowadays in psychiatry. If you see this paper of Hunt and Yegi, they really describe the framework of evolutionary perspective in all mental disorders, which is really, really interesting. And for ADHD, it's the seminal work is Evolution and Revolution in Child Psychiatry. Like, it's kind of a philosophical and anthropological theoretical paper, which explain how the symptoms are in fact really well adapted to natural environments, and how the animals are a kind of ADHD, like screening the environment all the time, which is for a child at school completely a problem. And also there is all this literature on dopamine receptor variants and migrant population. I will talk about that later, but yes, some variants of dopamine receptors have been associated with ADHD and novelty seekers, who might explain some reportation of ADHD and so on. So here we were interested in ADHD and explore-exploit trade-off in foraging. Like, if we consider this landscape as an internal landscape, exploring internal and external might be the same if it's under dopamine rules. So the experience we did this time is we asked children to find all the bells here. It's the bell test for heminegligency. If you know it, this bell, very simple, but standardized. And so we ask 80 children screened on the ADHD rating scale to find the bells, and we register the path, but as an external foraging, and as internal, we ask them to cite as many animal names as possible, as it has been demonstrated that searching for an item in our mind is like foraging in our mind. And we found that, yes, our hypothesis was consistent. As you can see here, a child that scored 47 on ADHD rating scale, we can see that his path of foraging is more chaotic than this one, who jumped to a bell to another with less jumps, big jumps as here. And we found exactly the same for the semantic fluency. People who score higher on ADHD rating scale tend to have longer distances between their items. And one precision is that in the mean is not different, is the longer distance that are higher. But if you just compute the mean distance between items, there was no differences, only on these parts of the distribution of distances. In addition to that, the performance of the children who scored higher on ADHD rating scale were lower in the visual domain, but higher in semantic domain, in which switching is really crucial for performance in semantic fluency. So it's completely consistent with our idea of evolutionary framework. Depending on the environment, people who present ADHD behavior are more or less adapted. And maybe it's an advantage for the group if you have a group of individuals who are completely cognitively the same, and the environment change. It's possible that the group could not adapt, but if you have a few months of ADHD, maybe it confers an advantage. So we replicated, not really replication, but as video games are a very promising avenue of experiences, we developed a serious game with these 3 students, Emilia Turk, Arthur Becerril, and Tatiana Zemkova. The YouTube link is here and also in the chat, because you might not hear the sound, which are natural sound of singing birds and river and so on. And the goal of the game is to collect mushrooms. So you can see that when you see a mushroom, it picks it up. And you forage like that during 10 minutes in this three-dimensional environments. Most of the participants said that it was very relaxing. Okay, and as these 3 students were students in engineering polytechnical school in Paris, no, that's not what I wanted to do. They developed some different physical statistics models. They extract some very simple parameters like the performance, the number of total mushroom collected. The diameter is the longer distance between 2 points of the path. The convex hull is the volume of the path. If you make this area volume, because the landscape is not flat. And they also developed some very complex models, which I will not develop here, but there was the mean curvature path, which is the it indicates somehow the number of change direction. And also the speed autocorrelation is a measure of the fact of the behavior if you walk a long time in straight line, or if you change direction. Diffusion model is a measure of randomness of trajectory. And there is also 2 measure of gain maximizing strategy, the trajectory volatility. It's somehow the distance of the path from the optimal path to collect the closest mushroom. And the distance from greedy strategy is somehow the same. Like if you, it indicates if you go to the direct, straightforward mushroom that you can see. Of course, all these measures are have collinearity. So we perform the principal component analysis. And we can see here that the first component is predict positively the ADHD score, indicating that the strategy and the path tend to be more exploratory for ADHD people. So here again, in a more ecological experience, we tested the hypothesis, and we succeed in testing this hypothesis of exploratory bias associated with ADHD. I don't know what time is it. Oh, okay. I think we're fine. So my idea is that ADHD is a problem of attention, but to me, it's more a problem of exploring versus exploiting type. Imagine that attention is, focusing your attention on something is like exploiting this idea, this train of thoughts, and focusing. So people who focus well are exploiter of their ideas, whereas ADHD is more an explorer, like it jumps from an idea to another, from a stimulus to another in external world. And this is completely consistent with the evolutionary of dopamine circuits. In very low evoluted, I don't know, I don't like to use this word speaking of evolution, but yes, in very basics animals, these circuits are used to modulate their foraging. And it has been demonstrated that dopamine receptors were different dopamine receptors give different foraging patterns in worms, for example. And at time with the evolution of animals, the cortical connection increased, and then evoluted animals such as chimps or are more with more complex behaviors, are foraging maybe for information and sustaining their attention. So to my mind, somehow the ADHD patterns, and I speak of ADHD who don't have other associated disorders, but really the people who have only difficulties to sustain attention since their childhood, maybe they have been selected in ancient environments and Paleolithic societies because they were they conferred an advantage. And maybe nowadays we are finding them in more artistic or domains, or maybe research. One last discovery I did during my PhD while reading articles on genetics, I found that one of the dopamine receptor, DR4, as a variant, the 7 repeat allele that has been associated with curiosity, novelty seeking, and ADHD. It appears around 50,000 before Christ. And surprisingly, it's around this same time that Homo sapiens came out of Africa. Here you can see that he arrived in Europe and so on, and he finally arrived in South America. So we might imagine that if it's true, by successive funding effects, if a group of people start from Africa to go farther and farther, in genetic, we call that funding effects. It concentrates this precise gene. And as you can see here, this variant in Americas is really much higher than in other part of the world. So I don't know, but maybe we are always discussing that in US or in America there is more ADHD than in Europe, but maybe somehow it's a kind of true and genetically driven. Who knows? I thank you very much for your attention, And if you have any question, it will be a pleasure.
Muchas gracias, Charlotte. Muchas gracias también a los asistentes. Tenemos un espacio para preguntas. Yo me voy a tomar la palabra porque tengo muchas. Me impresionó ese último resultado, o sea, bueno, ese último comentario que tú hiciste. No sé, ¿me escuchas bien? ¿Sí?
Yeah.
Ok. Bueno, primero, porque tengo la pregunta en el fondo atrapada, en el fondo, ¿por qué tú hipotetizas que primero que ADHD en el fondo pudiese estar, en el fondo, se mantenga en el tiempo más en Latinoamérica, y si eso pudiese estar vinculado, en el fondo, a otras variantes cognitivas, atencionales, perceptuales, metacognitivas, etcétera? Esa es mi primera pregunta.
Yes, I see. So maybe I was not completely clear with this funding effect. Imagine here a group of people who decide to explore more. You can imagine that they have a small percentage of people having these variants who are novelty seekers, and they go farther and farther. And but at time, it's always a small percentage of the group who decide to explore farther, and they concentrate their genetic traits. It's a phenomenon that is called funding effect in genetic. That's it's the same for example, blue eyes. For example, in the north of Europe, you have all this proportion of people who have blue eyes because it's a funding effect. Some people arrived here and they spread the gene. And sorry, did I answer the first part of your question?
Y la segunda parte, si tales diferencias con el resto del mundo pudiesen también vincular otras diferencias cognitivas. Por ejemplo, diferencias atencionales, diferencias perceptuales, diferencias metacognitivas, etc.
Yes, sorry. To me, in fact, this attention deficit is the consequence of exploring bias. If you consider that focusing your attention is exploiting your train of thoughts, and if you have this dopamine-dependent trade-off of exploring upon exploiting in your gene, you tend to exploit less. You focus less on your ideas, so you don't sustain your attention. And I think that metacognition is also linked on that. If you don't maintain your attention, you take less. Maybe if you are always distracted in your introspection, for example, you develop less your thoughts about yourself and your cognitive process. With the other disorders like association with dyslexia and so on, I think it's another problem. It's more developmental disorders. But really, for me, like ADHD traits for people who have only this single disorder could be due to this exploring bias.
Es sorprendente que pueda existir esa distinción. Te lo pregunto porque podríamos hipotetizar que hay un déficit de atención introspectivo, por ejemplo. El déficit de atención habitualmente se conoce hacia la atención externa, hacia la percepción de los objetos externos. ¿Podría existir un déficit de atención interna?
Yes, I think so. That you know that in ADHD you have this hyperactive and solely, and the other solely attention deficit without hyperactivity. So it is possible that that hyperactivity and impulsivity is more oriented toward external stimulus, and attention deficits is more attracted to internal thoughts.
Okay. Y mi última pregunta, que es más bien de un artículo que presentaste previamente en tu presentación, y que yo lo leí y me pareció súper interesante, en un artículo que está en Scientific Report, que no sé si quieres volver a esa diapositiva. En ese artículo tú señalas que en ADHD, en déficit de atención, probablemente exista una alteración en la transición de la atención. Y haces un comentario a William James, que a mí siempre me ha gustado y te lo he dicho en otras oportunidades. En el fondo dices, en realidad lo que puede estar ocurriendo es que en los pacientes ADHD existe un periodo de transición de la atención, o atención transitiva, que le llama William James, que pudiese explicar este salto constante de la atención de un objeto a otro. Me parece una idea súper creativa y súper innovadora en la literatura. No sé si te podrías referir a esa idea.
Yes, sure. Yes, I see exactly what you mean. It's maybe this idea of transition, and I tried to. This was my first idea at the end of the first paper, and that's how I imagine this experience of the scientific paper. Like the switch, how do you measure a switch? And it's very difficult because up to now we don't have the possibility to measure an episode of thought. Even with all the techniques of neural imaging, it's impossible. But yes, my idea is when you switch too much between train of thoughts, it might create this increase of mind blanking reports. Saying that you cannot report with words the content of your ideas does not mean that you don't have it at all. We have perfectly seen with subliminal vision and so on, that you have somehow a consciousness of your unconscious or unreportable thoughts. And if you transcribe to this idea, to this kind of switch, and especially in semantic fluency, if you jump from an area to another, and it makes association that are less frequent in the general population, so makes you more creative, I think. And I think that's, yes, possibly, I don't want to say that ADHD really, because for me it's a really real classification of our modern society. But in perspective of the fact that the gene appears around this time, and the migration, but also all the technological invention that appears after this moments, according to paleoanthropologists and archaeologists. My idea is really that a small amount of ADHD people in human populations maybe make a terrific advantage of Homo sapiens compared to previous hominins and so on, that makes them in a very short time colonizing the entire planet. Because Homo sapiens appeared, they said 200,000, but it's for some authors it's maybe more, around 300. And during all this time, nothing happens. They really they appeared in Africa and they stayed in this area in Africa, and suddenly there is a huge spread of our species everywhere with technological tools, a big diversification of the cultures and so on. Maybe it's due to, I won't say ADHD, but neurodiversity appearing around this time. It's a bit crazy, but I like it.
Mira, tenemos otra pregunta de Carlos Schmidt desde Barcelona. Dice, te la voy a leer, ¿vale? Dice, qué interesante perspectiva evolutiva, migratoria, de mayor ADHD en América. ¿Podemos saber si este mayor porcentaje de ADHD, variante dopamina, en América no se debe a un sobrediagnóstico? Por ejemplo, ¿pudieron controlar ese posible sesgo en el análisis? Ahora voy a dar una interpretación, a ver si se entiende bien la pregunta, que creo que sí. En Latinoamérica hay una polémica que hay un sobrediagnóstico del ADHD. ¿Ok? ¿Pudiesen los resultados estar sesgados por ese sobrediagnóstico?
That's why I did not use the diagnosis of ADHD, but really the prevalence of this dopamine variant. Okay. Because it's a variant associated with ADHD, but it's not completely correlated. And I completely agree that there is a problem of over-diagnosis, diagnosis of ADHD everywhere. But what makes what makes parents or people going to a psychiatrist and saying, I have a problem of attention? It makes that our environment changed. And some people feel unadapted to this new environment. And the 5% of patient is huge. To me, that's why it's probably not a disorder per se, but more an interaction of a change in environment and expectations of this new environment, and just a continuum of behavioral traits.
Muy bien. Tengo una pregunta más de Francisca Torrealba. Te la voy a leer. Ah, Francisca, estás tú. Dila tú.
Yes, there are many definitions of mind wandering on literature. This can lead on many different experiments. So the question is, what's your definition of mind wandering and how literature faced this problem?
Okay, yeah, you're completely right. Literature is very controversial, so that's why some researcher like Stawarzik and Darjambo and ourselves, we try to make to add some category. For most of the researcher, mind wandering and on task are the two possibility to answer. Mind wandering is everything that is not focused on the task. And it's more, and the definition, there's as many definitions as there is researcher. It depends on the way you plan your experience and so on. And you have a very interesting paper by Weinstein, Anna Weinstein. I can send you the references if you want, who inventories all the possibility to ask the fact that the way you ask the question can bias. For example, if you ask the participant, are you mind wandering or are you on task? It biases the response. Because if you say, it doesn't give exactly the same results if you said, are you on task? Yes or no? And so on. So Paul Selly, one of the specialists of the domain, just say that it's a family of phenomenon, and if you want to study it, you just have to define it very well in your, and that's fine, because yeah, it's a subjective phenomenon, so we cannot fix that. And I think, yeah, that's why I tend to use more the expression stream of consciousness, because I'm more interested in the fact that our mind wander from a state to another than the definition of mind wandering that comes from Jonathan Smallwood, who said the definition was really stimulus independent and self-generated. And to me, it can be very close to daydreaming, because it has to have some sustained representations.
Me voy a colgar de esa pregunta porque me interesó mucho. Muy buena pregunta. ¿Y eso qué implica? ¿Cuáles son las implicaturas de eso? Que el estudio de Mind Wandering tiene distintos protocolos para estudiar y por tanto diferentes resultados, ¿o existe un consenso? ¿Alguna taxonomía? ¿Alguna definición?
No, there is yes, some labs, some researcher like Kalina Christophe in Vancouver. She really defined in his book spontaneous, the science of spontaneous thoughts. Yes, there is a taxonomy, but I would say that the problem is even consciousness does not make an agreement. So if you I would say that if you define well what you want to say, what you want to study, that's fine. But of course, if you want to replicate, you have to use exactly the same definition.
Te lo pregunto porque, por ejemplo, si tú piensas en el terreno de la metacognición o la introspección experimental, que es un terreno, un dominio, hermano, amigo del mind wandering, y en ese caso, en este terreno puntualmente, se tomó una definición muy puntual. Tanto es así que la literatura, más o menos, acuerda tener una definición clara, definir protocolos y avanzar en una dirección. ¿Tú crees que ese es el futuro de la disciplina en Mind Wandering? ¿Tomar una definición y avanzar en una dirección en conjunto?
I think that's yes and no. Sorry for this. I think, and that's why I really thank Matt Mayer to replicate completely with a huge sample our experiences on mind wandering and ADHD. And I think that it's really important to make experience in different labs and with the same definition. But I'm completely against having a fixed taxonomy, because it's a subjective definition, and it will reduce maybe the possibility of
the complexity of the phenomenon.
The complexity of the phenomenon, I think.
Okay.
And I think it's also very cultural. We have to always remember that we are weird, weight educated, etc. And maybe we don't see some different aspect that the Buddhists, for example, could have. For example, we never, in our experiences, in our definition, we never integrate sensation and perception, which is really important. In fact, it's like in our psychological constructs, most of the time is like we are participants are pure spirits. But when we record their spontaneous verbal reports, we hear that, oh, I'm hungry, and so on, and it might impact their stream of consciousness. It impacts.
Yeah. Oye, bueno, muchas gracias, Charlotte. Siempre es bueno volver a ver a los compañeros de curso. Fue bueno, el público no lo sabe, pero con Charlotte estudiamos juntos, así que después de varios años nos reencontramos. Muchas gracias y nada, te esperamos en Chile.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I hope so. I will visit you soon.
Bien, y para,
if you can.
Y para el resto, yeah. Y para el resto que nos está escuchando, la próxima sesión va a ser la última semana de noviembre. Le haremos llegar un correo, está Marion Rouault, también, que les vamos a avisar cuándo va a estar el link y la información de esta actividad organizada por la Facultad de Psicología y el Laboratorio de Ciencias Cognitivas de la UDD. Vale, muchas gracias a todos los que pudieron asistir. Gracias, Charlotte. Chao, chao.
Bye bye.